and welcome to today's lecture on the decline and fall of the Old Kingdom and the rise of the First Intermediate Period. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we're going to look at how one of the greatest moments in ancient civilization begins to crumble. I mean, once you've built the Great Pyramid, it feels almost certain that the only place you can go is down. And we'll investigate both how and why that happens in today's lecture. So whether you're looking to start a revolution, or you just want to hold on to power a little bit longer, journey with me as we investigate the First Intermediate Period. We begin our story at the beginning of the Old Kingdom, when Egypt was growing and flourishing and the pharaoh Djoser was beginning construction on Egypt's very first pyramid. At this time, it still hadn't been that long since Upper and Lower Egypt, once distinct entities, had been united under a single ruler. And now that Egyptian power was growing, rulers were making expeditions into foreign lands, the Sinai and Libya, and the Levant and Punt. And during those excursions, it was important for the Egyptian core, the Delta and Nile River Valley, to remain stable and well-governed and prosperous. Now, the king's solution to this issue of how to govern an expansive land was to develop a system of provinces and provincial governors. Egyptologists today refer to these entities using their Greek terms. The provinces were known as nomes, and the provincial governors were known as nomarchs, or the leaders of the nomes. Somewhat amazingly, the term nomarch is still used in modern Greece today for the heads of different prefectures. Interesting parallel to the present. Now, early on, all the nomarchs actually lived with the king in the capital. This was beneficial for the king because it allowed him to keep close tabs on everyone. The problem, of course, is that it made it really inefficient for the nomarchs themselves to be able to do any governing in the provinces they were in charge of. Now eventually, in the middle of the 5th dynasty, nomarchs begin to govern from their home provinces instead of the capital. And this was great for being able to address problems quickly and actually get things done. But unfortunately for the Egyptian kings, this was also conducive to nomarchs gaining their own power, gathering the support of local populations who started to become more loyal to the nomarch than to the king himself. This rise in regional power, as opposed to the centralized power in the Egyptian capital, is one of the defining characteristics of what Egyptologists call intermediate periods, which are basically the opposite of strong, centralized kingdoms. When it comes to the causes of the collapse of the Old Kingdom and the rise of the First Intermediate Period, the increase in provincial leadership is certainly one of the main factors. Eventually, nomarch positions became hereditary, so power would stay within the same family. And nomarchs began to raise armies, battling with other nomes and other nomarchs for power and resources in their respective regions. We can see the rise in power of the nomarchs through the increasingly impressive tombs they erect during the 5th and 6th dynasties, while the tombs of the Egyptian kings during this time get smaller and smaller and smaller.
One of the most paradoxical causes of the collapse of the Old Kingdom was the incredibly long and successful rule of its last pharaoh, Pepi II. Most of the time, of course, having a long reign is a sign of great stability. During the Roman Empire, for example, the long reign of Augustus led to peace and prosperity. It allowed them to switch from the Republic to the Empire without many problems. Whereas the short reigns of the 3rd century emperors led to chaos and collapse. But Pepi II reigned so long, a total of 94 years, that by the time he died, he had outlived all his heirs. And it was unclear how the royal succession was supposed to occur after him.
On the one hand, Pepi II operated like many of his Old Kingdom royal predecessors. He sent expeditions into the Sinai east of the Nile River Delta to retrieve precious metals and minerals, and he traded with Nubia for gold and ebony and ivory, and he even established trade routes through the oases of the Western Desert. But the cracks were showing, and the end of the Old Kingdom was nigh.
His grandfather, for example, married the daughters of 2 nomarchs, showing that he needed those political alliances to maintain his power. Pepi II also added a second vizier position, one for Upper Egypt and one for Lower Egypt, further signifying the regionalization process that was taking place. After Pepi II's death at age 100, a ripe old age, Egypt soon declined into what we call the First Intermediate Period.
What happened in the aftermath of Pepi II is almost the exact opposite of Pepi II's unparalleled long reign. After 2 more 6th dynasty pharaohs each lasted about a year, the First Intermediate Period began with the 7th and 8th dynasties, and with incredible royal turnover. Manetho records that there were 70 kings that ruled for 70 days. Now, most scholars think this is more about rhetorical effect than about historical accuracy, but nonetheless, the idea of political chaos comes across very clearly.
What happened next is one of the hallmarks of intermediate periods, a split between the centers of power. Now, 2 capitals began to emerge, one in the north at Heracleopolis, sort of near the Old Kingdom capital of Memphis. This northern group of kings was known as the 9th and 10th dynasties. The other center of power was in the south at Thebes, back near the early dynastic capital of Hierakonpolis. And these Theban leaders, after establishing sufficient power, led an invasion of Lower Egypt in the north, eventually vanquishing their Heracleopolitan foes.
One of the less dramatic effects of the split between Upper and Lower Egypt was the re-emergence of regional styles of art. Artists in the north continued the artistic traditions of the Old Kingdom kings and artists, who held their capital at Memphis. In the south, however, a new Theban style of art was created. Now, to the untrained eye, it all looks pretty similar, but we see subtle changes such as deeper incisions, narrower shoulders, rounded limbs, a broadened nose, lines representing eye paint, and angular breasts. A slight departure from what we see in the north in the Memphite tradition.
We can see all these features on the relief sculpture known as the Stela of the Gatekeeper Ma'ati, that we're looking at right here. And what I want you to take away from this is not necessarily the exact details of the changes, but rather that they exist in the first place. Art wasn't just for aesthetic pleasure in ancient Egypt. It was an important way to signal one's identity, one's political allegiance, and one's place in society.
Because of the political and economic downturn of the First Intermediate Period, we have far fewer texts than we do with the massive inscriptions of the Old Kingdom. But one of the best preserved characters we know about is Ankhtifi, the nomarch of Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt. Now remember that the rise of power of nomarchs was a big part of the fall of the Old Kingdom. And Ankhtifi's power as nomarch is a useful example of increased power of intermediate period provincial rulers.
So the really weird thing here is that Ankhtifi is the nomarch living in Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt, in the south. But he's governing on behalf of the lower Egyptian kings in the north. All the while, the rulers of Thebes, nearby Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt, are plotting against those lower Egyptian kings. And Ankhtifi is caught in the middle of all of this mess, trying to fight against his neighbors on behalf of a king hundreds of miles away.
We know about Ankhtifi in particular because of his extremely well-preserved tomb, where he inscribes his autobiography on the walls. A short fragment goes, "I reached the west bank of the Theban province. Then my courageous crack troops, yes, my bold crack troops, ventured to the west and to the east of the Theban nome, looking for an open battle. But no one dared to come out from Thebes because they were afraid of my troops. I gave bread to the hungry and clothing to the naked. I anointed those who had no cosmetic oil. I gave sandals to the barefooted. I gave a wife to him who had no wife."
We can learn a few important things from Ankhtifi's autobiography. First, we see the political fragmentation as he refers to himself as the chief of the nome, rather than governing on behalf of the king in the north. He's really highlighting his own power. Second, we see that warfare is rampant as he marches his enemies against Thebes. Third, we see the economic problems that have arisen during this period, with Ankhtifi priding himself on providing for those who are less fortunate, those in economic need.
To conclude today's lecture, we're going to dive into an ancient papyrus called the Admonitions of Ipower, which provides some of the best and most controversial information potentially about the First Intermediate Period. The text itself is written in the Middle Kingdom, well after the First Intermediate Period, and it tells the story of chaos and disorder with the hope of teaching its reader a lesson about how to behave.
The content of this text focuses on a complete overturn of the natural order of things. So, for example, a girl who used to have to look at her face in the water now actually has a fine mirror. And somebody who used to just have a box to live in now has nice furniture. And the rich man, the guy living really well off, he's been reduced to poverty. Respect for the king and for the gods has completely disappeared, and even the king's burial has been desecrated and looted.
After the main character Ipower pleads to the sun god for help, things begin to improve. But unfortunately for us, the reader, the historian, the archaeologist, the end of the text is cut off. So we don't know how the god that this is addressed to would have responded. Although most scholars think it would have ended with a strong king and the restoration of order.
Now, the debate about this text concerns whether the events in the text represent actual happenings of the First Intermediate Period, or whether they're generic descriptions meant to set the scene and teach the reader a lesson. Early on, scholars believed the former, that they were looking at a description of the chaos that was actually happening in the First Intermediate Period. But as Egyptian texts have become better understood, scholars have begun to realize that there's an entire genre dedicated to this sort of text. Stories that tell of disasters and disorders due to weak rule and piety. And as a result, the modern interpretation is that we're dealing with a text meant to send a message rather than to record a particular history. The admonitions of Ipower show us that we have to be just as careful when interpreting a text as we are when interpreting archaeological remains. Just because it seems as though it's describing a chaotic first intermediate period, it may actually have very little to do with the historical events that are taking place in Egypt during that time. In fact, many modern scholars now believe that the first intermediate period wasn't really a time of chaos at all. For most of the people in Egypt at that time, they argue, things didn't change all that much, and there was actually strong innovation during this period. It's simply that we usually read Egyptian history from the walls of the pharaoh's tombs and the temples, and so fragmentation and regionalization seems like something bad because we're just getting the perspective of the royalty. Now, Peter Baelish from Game of Thrones once said that chaos is a ladder. And for many of the local rulers during the first intermediate period, that certainly seems to have been the case. Just a couple lessons you can take away from the first intermediate.